There was once a little girl in Gaza who loved the sound of waves more than the sound of silence. But silence came anyway, shaped like fire. What you're about to read is not fiction. This is a true story. A war story carved into the ruins of Palestine, soaked in the psychology of loss and the echoes of everything Israel destroyed. I survived one massacre as a child. I did not survive the second. On July 17, 2025, I was killed by an Israeli airstrike, just like my family before me. But before my voice was silenced, I left behind this story, not for sympathy, but because the world has forgotten what it means to listen. This is Gaza. This is what war does to children. This is what happens when justice is buried deeper than the bodies. So now, even from beyond the rubble, I will speak. The morning of that day arrived like any other in Gaza, filled with the faint scent of sea salt carried by a warm wind, the laughter of my brothers echoing in the narrow streets, and my mother's gentle voice calling us to hurry before the beach grew too crowded. I was 9 years old, and for that single morning I allowed myself to believe that perhaps we were a normal family living in a normal place, untouched by war, distant from headlines and politics, far removed from the cruel grip of Israel's constant shadow over Palestine. We were just a family heading to the seaside, carrying bread wrapped in cloth, a kettle of mint tea, and my father's small transistor radio playing a soft, crackling tune. That was our story. A true story. One that didn't yet involve blood or loss or tragedy. One that felt full of possibility, not pain. My older sister had tied my hair in 2 careful braids, humming a lullaby our grandmother used to sing, while my youngest brother held my hand, asking if the sea would be cold today. In that fleeting hour, I didn't think of politics. I didn't think of Israel or Gaza, or of what it meant to live in a land soaked in war stories and broken promises. I thought only of shells I would collect, waves I would run from, and how my father's laughter always seemed louder near the sea. But even in those tender moments, deep in my chest there was something else, an echo maybe, a kind of tension that never left. Gaza was not a place where peace ever truly settled. It hovered like dust, waiting to be blown away at the first gust of wind. Still that morning I clung to it. I built sandcastles beside my brothers as if we weren't building them atop a graveyard. But even as we shaped moats in the sand and drew flags on paper that fluttered weakly in the breeze, there was something about the silence between the waves that felt heavier than it should have been, like the sky itself was holding its breath, like Gaza had learned long ago how to pretend calm while trembling underneath, as if even the earth was exhausted by carrying the weight of too many war stories buried in its soil. I remember the way the mint tea smelled, sweet and sharp, and how my mother's eyes softened as she passed the cups to each of us, her hands trembling slightly but her smile fixed and brave, because in Gaza, mothers learn how to mask fear with routine, how to disguise anxiety behind the gentle folds of bread, how to anchor their children in ritual with the sea itself cannot promise safety. We were surrounded by so much blue, sky, water, the tiny cloth blanket beneath us, and yet, that blue was not freedom. It was a reminder of what we could never touch: peace. The psychology of survival in Gaza is not something written in books. It lives in the way children scan the sky before they laugh too loud, in the way fathers pause before turning on the radio, fearing what frequency might carry not music but mourning, and in the way girls like me memorize the names of the dead, the way others memorize fairy tales. My war story began long before that day, but it found its climax in a single breath, a single second, a single flash that tore through our quiet joy like a scream through silence. And then it happened. A sound so unnatural, so violent, it didn't feel real. It felt like the earth itself had cracked open above us. There was a sudden light, blinding and wrong, and then the sound of everything I loved shattering into pieces I would never be able to pick up again. I didn't realize I was screaming until I tasted sand and blood in my mouth. I didn't know whose arms I was reaching for, because they were all gone in a blink. In that cursed instant when Israel decided that a beach in Gaza was a battlefield and not a place where a family told their true story in the language of picnics and lullabies. My father's radio landed near me, still hissing softly, a static lullaby for a child who no longer had a father. My sister's braid had come undone and lay beside her like a ribbon that had lost its meaning. The bread we packed was soaked in tea and blood, and my brothers, oh God, my brothers, they were too quiet, and that silence was louder than any explosion. This was not a dream. This was not fiction. This was a true story, unfolding in the ruins of a moment that was supposed to be simple and sacred. And the cameras came. They always come. They captured my face, my screams, my hands covered in ash and panic and pieces of everything I loved. They called me the symbol of war, the little girl from Gaza whose sorrow had become a headline. But they never asked me what it felt like. They never wanted to hear the real war story. Not the clean version for newspapers, but the messy, unbearable truth that I would carry forever in the hollows of my chest. What is the psychology of a child who sees everything she loves erased in a second? What happens to the soul when it breaks, before it even understands what life is supposed to be? No one tells you that trauma doesn't come in one big wave. It comes in echoes, in nightmares, in the way you flinch when a door slams, in the way you forget how to speak for days at a time because there is no language for losing everything except tears. In Gaza, we cry with our eyes open. We mourn with our hands busy. We survive with our hearts half functioning. In the days that followed, I stopped speaking. I stopped eating. I stopped pretending. I clutched my sister's scarf to my chest like it was a map to the past. My aunt tried to hug me, and I recoiled. The psychologists came. They used words I didn't understand. Dissociation, shock, post-traumatic stress. They drew diagrams and took notes, but none of them could draw my family back. None of them could explain why Israel was allowed to rewrite my childhood in fire. They said, "This is Gaza." They said, "This is war." They said, "This is the cost." But I was not a number. I was a child. And this was my story. A true story, not one shaped by generals or governments, but by the hands of a little girl clutching the shirt her mother folded the night before the sky betrayed us. Sometimes I imagined what life would have been like if we hadn't gone to the beach that day. Would I still be braiding my sister's hair? Would my brothers be chasing kites in the street? Would my father still be singing to his radio? But wishing changes nothing in Palestine. We learn young that grief is the soil we grow from. I began to write, not because it healed me, but because it gave shape to the chaos inside. I wrote names, places, smells, sounds. I wrote so the world wouldn't forget that the victims have voices too. I wrote because the war story I lived through had to be remembered not as an accident but as evidence. And from that rubble, from that unbearable silence, a dream formed. Not the kind of dream most girls my age had. Not of dresses or parties, but of justice. Of speaking in a courtroom. Of pointing to a map and saying, "Here, this is where my family was killed." Of looking into the eyes of the world and demanding that someone, anyone, listen. Because in the end, I was not just a girl from Gaza. I was the war story they tried to silence. I was the voice that Israel could not erase. I was the beginning of something louder than bombs. And that night, as I lay under a roof that no longer felt like shelter, staring at stars that looked too far away to help, I whispered a promise to the sky. A quiet vow, buried beneath grief and ash. One day, I will grow up. One day, I will become the voice of every child lost to this endless war. One day, I will turn this true story into the justice it deserves. They say justice wears a blindfold. But here in Gaza, we learn to see even when it hurts. Because closing our eyes has never saved us, and silence has never protected us from the storm. We survive by seeing too much, by remembering everything, by turning wounds into testimony. When I began my studies at the Islamic University of Gaza, the textbooks in my bag were heavier than they should have been, not because of their size or weight, but because I carried them like gravestones, symbols of the family I had buried in the sand, emblems of the story that still screamed beneath my skin. A true story, carved by missiles, burned into memory by Israel's brutal campaign against my childhood, against every child's future in Palestine. I walked through the university gates not as a hopeful young girl, but as a survivor, wrapped in invisible scars, still hearing the waves of that cursed beach day inside my ears, still feeling the static of my father's broken radio in my chest, still smelling the smoke that turned a peaceful morning into a never-ending war story. People around me smiled. They dreamed of law firms and careers, but I could not afford dreams that didn't bleed. I was not studying law to build a life. I was studying law to document lives lost, to give voice to Gaza's silenced children, to turn pain into paper, trauma into legal structure, psychology into political evidence, and to hold Israel accountable for every shattered home, every amputated limb, every bedtime story interrupted by a drone. It was strange how normal the world seemed inside those classrooms. Even as outside, Gaza collapsed in pieces, our windows rattling from distant bombings, our electricity cutting off mid-lecture, our notebooks stained with candle wax and ash. But we continued, because in Gaza the act of learning is resistance, and knowledge is a form of survival, a fragile but defiant rejection of the occupation that tries to keep us ignorant and afraid. My classmates were brilliant, resilient, fierce in their own quiet ways. Many of them had lost siblings, some had lost parents. Others had seen their own bodies marked permanently by war. But none of us allowed that pain to paralyze us. Instead, we carried our stories into the lecture halls like sacred burdens, turning every legal theory into a question that burned with urgency. Who protects the children of Gaza when international law becomes a whisper? When I read the Geneva Conventions, I didn't see theory. I saw my brother's body cradled in my lap, blood pooling into sand that could no longer absorb our sorrow. When I studied the definitions of war crimes, I didn't see paragraphs. I saw my mother shielding us with her body, whispering prayers that God alone heard in the seconds before the sky exploded. And when I read about justice, I felt rage. Not because I didn't believe in justice, but because I had seen how it was denied to us over and over again. How the world called us statistics, collateral damage, unfortunate incidents, when in truth we were stories, true stories, living, breathing war stories that deserved to be heard, believed, remembered. During those years, I wrote constantly. Not just for my classes, but for my sanity. For the children of Gaza who no longer had voices. For the countless families who died without a trial, without recognition, without dignity. I filled notebook after notebook with testimonies from the camps, the clinics, the destroyed neighborhoods. Stories of children who drew flowers on crumbling walls. Stories of mothers giving birth under bombings. Stories of teenagers arrested for throwing stones. Stories of men buried without names. Stories of silence so loud it could crush your soul. These were not mere anecdotes to me, not passing tragedies to be consumed and forgotten. They were the bricks of my argument, the pillars of my outrage, the precise moments where my personal grief met legal terminology, where my private mourning aligned with global accountability. These weren't just stories, they were indictments. Each line I wrote was a quiet, stubborn declaration that Gaza was not disposable, that Palestine was not voiceless, and that Israel's actions would be remembered, not as history written by victors, but as a true story written by survivors. The more I studied, the more I understood that the law, though powerful in ink, was powerless without will. Justice was not inevitable. It had to be hunted, cornered, and held to the light. And so I sharpened my knowledge like a blade, not for vengeance, but for truth. I trained my memory to hold details like evidence. The date of the strike, the name of the street, the exact time the sirens failed to sound. I turned my mind into an archive, because no court could deny what I refused to let die. In practice sessions, my voice often trembled, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of what I carried. I wasn't rehearsing for a career. I was training to resurrect the dead with words. I wanted to speak for the boy who choked on dust beneath collapsed ceilings, for the girl who was shot while fetching water, for the teacher whose classroom became a morgue. These were the cases I prepared for, not hypotheticals, but flesh and blood tragedies. The everyday war stories of Gaza turned legal frameworks, the true stories of Palestine forced to wear masks of silence. And even when the professors couldn't answer my questions about precedent, about jurisdiction, about justice in the face of power, I didn't stop asking them, because I wasn't seeking reassurance. I was demanding reckoning. I needed the world to stop using our pain as a political football. I needed them to see Gaza not as a footnote, but as the front line of human rights, the bleeding evidence of a world that had chosen complicity. Graduation did not feel like a celebration. It felt like the slow exhale after years of holding my breath. As I held my diploma, I felt no joy, only responsibility. I had crossed a threshold, not into peace, but into deeper struggle. I had become something more than a student. I was now a living brief, a walking witness, a case file in motion. And I knew that somewhere, someday, I would find myself in a real courtroom. And when I did, I would not plead. I would present. I would not tremble. I would testify. And I would say, with the unwavering voice of a girl who had lived through the unspeakable, this is my story. This is Gaza's war story. This is Palestine's true story. And this is why justice cannot wait. They say every story has an end, but in Gaza, endings are rarely peaceful. They come not with closure, but with craters. Not with silence, but with sirens. Not with justice, but with obliteration. And on the morning of July 17th, 2025, I woke with the eerie feeling that the sky itself was grieving. There was a strange stillness in the air, not the kind that comforts you, but the kind that warns you. The clouds were thick, gray, and unmoving, as if they too had paused to hold their breath, knowing what the day would bring. Even the birds, those tireless witnesses to our suffering, seemed to have fled. I dressed slowly, as if each movement deserved reverence. I packed my files, knowing they contained more than arguments. They carried names, facts, dates, and testimonies. They were the heartbeats of the voiceless. I had a hearing scheduled, a legal matter so routine in the outside world, yet in Gaza, every courtroom becomes a battleground for truth. As I stepped into the narrow streets of Jabalia, with their crumbling buildings and ghost-like quiet, children waved at me from broken windows and twisted alleyways. "Huda, are you going to bring justice today?" one of them asked, clutching a flat football in one hand and a piece of bread in the other. I smiled, not because I believed the answer was yes, but because in Gaza, a smile is a child's last defense against despair. I'd always known that my story was not mine alone. My true story was the collective story of Gaza's daughters and sons, of mothers who bled into rubble, of fathers buried beneath cinder blocks, of babies who died nameless. My war story was one stitched with blood and prayers, one Israel tried to erase, one the world tried to ignore, one Palestine whispered into the wind so that history could not forget. And then, it happened. A flash, a whistle, a silence so total it shattered the air. I remember a blinding white light exploding in the sky, and for a brief moment, I thought the sun had finally come to end it all. But it wasn't light. It was death. It was Israel. It was the missile that found me not in a battlefield, not holding a weapon, but holding court documents soaked with the ink of truth. It was the missile that saw me not as a threat, but as a voice. And in Gaza, a voice is the most dangerous thing you can have. I hit the ground before I knew I'd fallen. My bag flew from my shoulder, its contents dancing through the smoke, like the last gasp of resistance. My body felt numb, but my mind was sharp. I could feel the blood escaping me, eager to reunite with the soil of my ancestors. And I realized then that I was returning to the sea, to the sand, to the 9-year-old girl on the beach who once screamed for her father. And in that moment, I wasn't afraid. Because justice, I had come to understand, doesn't always wear a black robe or speak from a bench. Sometimes justice bleeds. Sometimes it dies in alleyways. Sometimes it wears the face of a girl from Gaza who refused to be silent. Sometimes justice begins in martyrdom. As I lay dying, my body broken but my spirit wide awake, I thought of the children of Gaza, those still alive. Those who might one day read my name in a footnote or see my picture in a headline and wonder why the world didn't protect me. I thought of all the people who had the power to stop this and chose instead to scroll past, to stay neutral, to debate our suffering like an academic question. Let me say this plainly now. Neutrality is a choice, and in the face of Israel's crimes, neutrality is complicity. You who watch from afar, who change the channel when Gaza burns, who read our war story and call it unfortunate but inevitable. You are not innocent. You are participants in the slow execution of a people, accomplices to a crime that will haunt the conscience of history. You have allowed Palestine to be a testing ground for weapons, for silence, for psychological warfare disguised as policy. And you wonder why we shout, why we throw stones, why we write with fire. Because when every breath becomes a political act, when every step risks triggering a drone, when every hospital bed becomes a courtroom of last words, and when every bedtime story turns into an obituary in waiting, you no longer dream of peace, you dream of being heard before you're buried. So I ask you, what justice can exist in a world where my blood must spell out the truth that your conscience refused to read? What humanity remains in you when my body lies broken in the street, and your only reaction is silence wrapped in sophistication, empathy packaged as performance, concern diluted by distance? You speak of complex conflicts, of ancient rivalries, of diplomacy and negotiations, while my people are erased in real time. Their names replaced by numbers, their childhoods documented in rubble, their futures pre-approved for destruction. You justify, analyze, politicize everything but recognize that this is not fiction. This is not theory. This is not a historical abstraction. This is a true story, born not of exaggeration but of evidence, carried not by myth but by memory, and it is written across the walls of Gaza in soot and ash, in shattered glass and broken lullabies, in the final gasps of children whose only crime was to be born on the wrong side of a checkpoint, under the wrong flag, in a land the world has deemed too complicated to save. Do not call me tragic, because tragedy implies helplessness, and I was never helpless. I was defiant. I was deliberate. I was loud in a world that tried to mute me. And I chose to live, to speak, to fight with words even when bullets silenced the room. Do not mourn me in silence, for your silence is the sound of complicity. the echo of a world too comfortable to care, too comfortable to act. Do not reduce me to a hashtag, an image, a soundbite, to be consumed and forgotten with the next wave of headlines. For my name is not a trend, it is a testimony. You cannot both pity us and ignore us. You cannot grieve our children while funding the bombs that kill them. You cannot weep for my story while denying its truth. I am no longer a body to bury, but a memory to carry. I am not ash. I am resistance. I am not silence. I am the scream that lives on. I am justice that refused to die quietly. And in those last seconds, when the sky turned back to smoke and the world faded into the shadows, I did not fear what came next. I whispered into the wind, into the blood-stained air of Gaza, into the heart of Palestine, into the soul of the oppressed everywhere. Tell them I was here. Tell them I lived. Tell them I fought with ink and breath and fire. Tell them I died holding my truth like a torch. And tell them this war story, this true story, will not end here. It will rise, it will echo, it will burn in every silence, until even the silence begins to scream.